from West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
Support for the following is provided by the West Virginia Department of Education and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Hey! Hey everyone, it's Education Station!
Hi, and welcome back to Education Station. I'm your host, Alex Milanese. Education Station is a show where we invite teachers from all across West Virginia to submit videos of themselves teaching their favorite lessons. In today's episode, we've got 3 exciting lessons about reading, math, and learning from home. So we're kicking off today's episode with Miss Perry, who has an awesome lesson about connections and relationships when reading. Let's check it out.
Hi everyone, it's Miss Perry again, and today we are going to talk about connections and relationships. So you may be familiar with text to text, text to self, and text to world, and while that is important to analyze whenever we read, when we look at our standards, connections and relationships are a lot more than that. It's really connections between people, events, and ideas in whatever we're reading. So this skill that we're talking about today can actually be applied to fiction as well as nonfiction. What we're going to do today is we are going to review the different connections and relationships first. We are then going to read a short story that's in the public domain by the Brothers Grimm. When we read, I want you to identify some people, events, and ideas in that story. And then when we're done, we're going to analyze the different relationships between those people, events, and ideas. So let's get started. First off, when we read, we make connections between ideas, people, and events in a text. And so I like to remind my students that we need to ask, how are things related in what we're reading? And so when you ask that question and you take a look at the people, ideas, and events, you come up with some different connections. And so here are some common ones. For example, big event to a person, and vice versa. How can a person impact a big event? How can an idea impact a person? And vice versa again, how can a person generate or create an idea? And how can that idea then go on and impact other people? The third one is cause and effect, and this often occurs with events. So how is an event caused? And then what are the effects of that event? Next is problem and solution, and we see this connection most often in nonfiction texts. Next, part to a whole. And so in a piece of fiction, that might be personality or character traits of a character that we're examining. Or in a nonfiction text, we might be describing a topic or a item. And then finally, similars and differences. And this might be one of the most popular connections and relationships that we analyze whenever we read in both fiction and nonfiction. So after we identify people, events, and ideas, we're going to look for some of these different types of connections that are often found in our reading. All right, so before we get started, I want to make sure you understand, and it's helpful with a piece of paper if you create 3 columns and then you write down people, events, and ideas as we read. That would be very helpful to keep all of your thoughts and ideas organized. And if you would like to read along, please feel free to go to the website here as I read aloud, and then that might be helpful as you continue to write down any people, any events, and any ideas in this story by the Brothers Grimm. Here we go. This is the story, The Elves and the Shoemaker by the Brothers Grimm. A shoemaker, by no fault of his own, had come so poor that at last he had nothing left but leather for 1 pair of shoes. So in the evening, he cut out the shoes, which he wished to begin to make the next morning, and as he had a good conscience, he lay down quietly in his bed, commended himself to God, and fell asleep. In the morning, after he said his prayers and was just going to sit down to work, the 2 shoes stood quite finished on his table. He was astounded and knew not what to say to it. He took the shoes in his hands to observe them closer, and they were so neatly made that there was not one bad stitch in them, just as if they were intended as a masterpiece. Soon after, a buyer came in, and as the shoes pleased him so well, he paid more for them than was customary, and with the money, the shoemaker was able to purchase leather for 2 pairs of shoes. He cut them out at night, and next morning was about to set to work with fresh courage, but he had no need to do so, for when he got up, They were already made, and buyers also were not wanting, who gave him money enough to buy leather for 4 pairs of shoes. The following morning, too, he found the 4 pairs made, and so it went on constantly. What he cut out in the evening was finished by the morning, so that he soon had his honest independence again, and at last became a wealthy man. Now it befell that one evening not long before Christmas, when the man had been cutting out, he said to his wife before going to bed, "What think you if we were to stay up tonight to see who it is that lends us this helping hand?" The woman liked the idea and lighted a candle, and then they hid themselves in a corner of the room behind some clothes which were hanging up there and watched. When it was midnight, 2 men came, sat down by the shoemaker's table, took all the work which was cut out before them, and began to stitch and sew and hammer so skillfully and so quickly their little fingers that the shoemaker could not turn away for his eyes' astonishment. They did not stop until all was done and stood finished on the table, and they ran quickly away. Next morning, the woman said, "The little men have made us rich, and we really must show that we are grateful for it. They run about so and must be cold. I'll tell thee what I'll do. I'll make them little shirts and coats and vests and trousers, and knit both of them a pair of stockings. And do thou too make them 2 little pairs of shoes." The man said, "I shall be very glad to do it." And one night, when everything was ready, they laid their presents all together on the table instead of the cutout work, and then concealed themselves to see how the little men would behave. At midnight, they came bounding in and wanted to get to work at once. But as they did not find any leather cut out, but only the pretty little artists of clothing, they were at first astonished, and then they showed intense delight. They dressed themselves with the greatest rapidity, putting the pretty clothes on and singing, "Now we are boys so fine to see, what should we longer cobblers be?" Then they danced and skipped and leapt over chairs and benches. At last they danced out the doors. From that time forth they came no more. But as long as the shoemaker lived, all went well with him, and all his undertakings prospered. Take a minute now. Review. Do you need to write any more people, events, or ideas down? And let's take a look at what you identified. So first off, let's look at the people. We see the shoemaker and his wife. There's the first customer, and then the more buyers, and then the 2 little elves that come in at midnight. Now, here are several events in this story that are also related to the people. So, for example, the shoes were already made by the elves, but the shoemaker did not know that. The customer was pleased and paid a higher price, and then the shoemaker bought more leather, and then more buyers came in. And so we can see this cause and effect chain of events happening. Finally, the shoemaker and his wife decided to stay up until midnight, and they figured out that these elves were the ones actually making the shoes. And so the shoemaker then asked his wife to make clothes for the elves. Now, within these events, there are several different ideas. For example, we start off with poverty, that the shoemaker and his wife don't have a lot, but they are content with their life, and that he says his prayers at night. He's not upset. He doesn't wish for a different life. He doesn't want to be anything other than a shoemaker, but he's not able to survive like he needs to, and so these elves come and help him. When they stay up to see who is making these shoes, the shoemaker and his wife become thankful. And so they make the clothes for the elves, who don't come back anymore because they recognize that the shoemaker and his wife are thankful and that they are prosperous. And so when we look at these different ideas, it actually gives us a clue into what is the most important idea of this story. I like to think of that as theme, or the deeper message of this story. And it's not that he's content, because things do change. All of these events change. And it's not that he's prosperous. It's not that he ends up making money. But the real deeper message, the important idea of this story, is that thankfulness, that because they were thankful, because they then made the clothes to thank the elves, It shows that the elves were thankful in part for all the work that they had done, and that recognized that the shoemaker and his wife are now ready to go about their lives. They don't need the elves anymore. So when we take a look at all of these different connections, we see not only the deeper meaning, but we see how the different people in the story are related to one another, how those people create events, often in a cause and effect chain of events, and how what those people do in those events impact the ideas that are presented in the text. Thank you so much for learning about connections and relationships with me today.
Thanks, Miss Perry. Okay, so next up, we're going to switch gears from reading and literacy to math and numeracy. Our next contributor, Miss Sinisi, has a great lesson to refresh us on how to work with decimals. Let's check it out.
Today we're going to look at a math lesson. This is number 6. It's Introduction to Decimals. We just finished fractions and we're going to start a new series on decimals. And so we want to look at what is a decimal. A number, it's based on 10 and it has to contain a decimal point in order to be a decimal. And we'll look at that more here in a minute. The decimal point is going to go between the ones and the tens place. In our example here we have 45.6. So when we look, we have a 4 in tens place, a 5 in ones place, then here's our decimal point, and to the right of the decimal point, this is what's called tenths place. So our 6 is in tenths place. When we read this number, we would say 45 and 6/10. So that's how we read a decimal. So we're going to learn more about reading decimals and identifying those. And then next time we'll look at how we count money using decimals. So here's our number, 45.6. We have 4 tens, 5 ones, and 6/10 in this number. And then what I did here was kind of just break it down so you could see how many of each. So here is one row of 10 dots, and we have 4 rows of 10 dots. That represents our 40. And then here are 5 dots, which represents our 5 ones. And then here are 10 X's, and then 6 of them are squared in here or circled, and that represents our 6/10. So how does this work? It's all about place value. When we write numbers, the position that we put them in or the place in which they are very important. It would be like me telling you I have $1 compared to $10 compared to $100 compared to $1,000. Where I put that decimal point defines how much of each number I have. So in the number 526, this 6 is in the ones position. We have 6 ones, right? If we move over, 2 is in the tens position. So here in this instance, we have 2 tens. And if you have 2 tens, that's 20. And then the 5 is in hundreds position. We have 5 hundreds in this instance. So if we continue on and look at our numbers, I put them here for you. We just read this 526. That's how you read that number. This one does not have a decimal point. So as we move to the left, each position gets 10 times bigger. If we have ones here and we multiply by 10, we get tens. If we have tens here and we multiply by 10, we get hundreds, right? What would happen if we multiplied hundreds by tens? We would get thousands, and so on. So as we move to the left, we're increasing our number by 10 each time, by 10 times bigger. So tens are 10 times bigger than ones, and hundreds are 10 times bigger than tens. But what if we move in the opposite direction? What if we move to the right? As we move to the right, each position is going to get 10 times smaller. So here in 526, 100 divided by 10 is 10. 10 divided by 10 is 1. We're getting 10 times smaller as we move this way. So what if we continue to go past ones? What happens when we get 10 times smaller than 1, right? That is called a tenth, or 1 over 10, right? That's what's our first position after our decimal is going to be 10 times smaller than 1. So 526.7 it gives us 500s, 21s, 6 10s, and 7 tenths because it's after the decimal, right? We can continue with smaller and smaller values from tenths. So from tenths, we can go 10 times smaller is hundredths, 10 times smaller is thousands. So that's how we're going to move when we go to the right of the decimal. We can write numbers as large and as small as we want to using decimal points. That's the point of the decimal system. So we can show those values of things that are much smaller than 1. Digits can be placed to the left or the right of the decimal point to show values greater or less than 1. The decimal point is the most important part of the decimal number. Without it, we can't tell what positions are which. So we have to put that decimal there. In this example, we have 22, and then we have our decimal, and 675. If we look to the left, 22 is a whole number. That's just 2 1s and 2 10s, 22. If we look to the right, we have 675 thousandths because that's our last place when we look here. This is in tenths place, this is in hundredths place, this is in thousandths place. So that's how we would read that decimal. So here's our example. If I gave you this number and you were looking at it, how would you read that to me? What would you tell me it is? That number is 2 3 tenths. We have 2 is our whole number and 3 is in tenths place. 2 3 tenths. What about this number? If we were looking at this number, how would we read it? It is 13 76 hundredths, right? This is in tenths place, that's in hundredths place. The last one takes us 3 digits beyond the decimal, and when we're reading this, we would say 126 774 thousandths, because this 7 is in tenths place, this 7 is in hundredths place, and that 4 is in thousandths place.
Thanks, Ms. Sinisi. You know, now more than ever, a lot of our students are learning from home, and we know that can be very challenging both for the students and the parents. So our final segment today comes from Ms. Close and Mr. Lambert, who are going to share some ideas we can use while learning from home. Let's check it out.
My name's Dustin Lambert.
And I'm Erica Close, and Dustin and I work at the West Virginia Department of Education, where we both work in the Office of Middle and Secondary Learning, and we work with teachers, and we work with those who teach middle school students and high school students.
So the goal of today's session is to share some more ideas and resources with you as you support your children who may be in middle school or high school. Yeah, so let's get started. The first idea that we want to share with you is called a book in a box. Eric and I both know, and as many people do, the best way to support readers is to encourage them to continue reading. And it doesn't matter what students are engaged in reading. It could be a magazine, it could be a novel, short stories, comic books, newspapers, whatever it is, as long as your children are reading at home. And that's the most important thing to promote reading and reading comprehension. So to multiply the impact of reading on vocabulary and comprehension, the best way to do so is to ask your students questions about what they've read. Now, this may be a little difficult if you've not read the passage or the text that they've read. So here's an activity that we'd like to share with you. And the best part of this activity is everything you need is right at home. So the idea is students would gather in a box or a bag items that represent certain things in the book. It could be an item that reminds them of the characters, or items that remind them of a setting or the problem. And they collect those items and then express those ideas back to you. So Eric, it looks like you have a book selection here. And you want to tell us about your book and what you did for your book in a box?
Sure. So for my book in a box, I chose Anne of Green Gables. Anne of Green Gables is one of my all-time favorite books. I read this book when I was 5th grade, 6th grade, maybe. Absolutely fell in love with it. It's a series of books, so It sustained me probably through a year or two.
Yes.
And it was great. So I decided to go through my house today to find objects to put in my box.
Yeah, let's see what you got.
And I have to say, it was a lot of fun. I ended up with a basket.
Nice, a basket will work.
Baskets, because it was handy, but a lot of Anne of Green Gables takes place with her outside walking around, and she spends a lot of time actually in an orchard. There are orchards on her farm where she grows up. So there's apple trees, and she's often sitting under apple trees and picking apples. So this is the sort of basket that you would carry apples in, or fruit that you pick from a fruit tree.
Cool.
So part of my book in the box is actually my basket, my container. You know, one of the things that is so important about the main character in Anne of Green Gables, Anne Shirley, is the fact that she has red hair. I didn't have any red hair at home, but I found some red fabric, and I actually braided it because Anne always seems to have braids. And her red hair is really important to the story, mostly because she's often picked on about her red hair. And it often causes her to have a lot of events in her life because of her red hair, because she's got people that are picking on her about her red hair.
So the conflict sometimes centers around this red hair.
The conflict in the book often centers around the red hair.
Understand.
And, you know, there's one very specific conflict that's around the red hair when there's someone in her class that is picking on her about her red hair, pulling her red hair, and he calls her carrots. And it's one of my favorite scenes in the whole book. But in that scene, Anne picks up her slate. Now, I didn't have a slate because I don't write on a slate very often, but I had this little mini fake chalkboard sign. And in the story, Anne picks up her slate, and she gets so mad that she cracks the slate over this boy's head. And it's a really important part of this story and really dramatic. So I found something to represent the slate, even though I didn't have a slate. One of the really important scenes in Anne of Green Gables is when Anne is invited to tea. And it's a big deal because she gets to go to tea with an older woman sort of in the community who invites her over to meet her. And it's a very formal and fancy tea. And it's something that means the world to Anne. And I always remember that part of the book. So I saw this teacup and I went and I found this teacup. So it will always remind me of that event where Anne got to interact with an older person that became really important to her later on. So Anne is asked to tea. One of the other neat parts of the book is when Anne communicates with her friend Diana. So Diana's her neighbor, and at night, when they probably should be sleeping, they would light a candle and put a lit candle in their windows, and they would make signals somehow covering the candle and between their two homes. And it was kind of funny because as I was reading that, I was thinking, you know, we're doing a lot of remote conversations right now. And even over 100 years ago, there were ways that we could have remote conversations. So Anne and Diana made up their own code and had their own conversations. And thus we have the candle. And the last thing, really quickly, one of the things in the book that's so important is that Anne always wanted to dress with puffed sleeves. And I will admit, I wore this dress when I was really, really young. But what I loved so much about this dress was that it had sleeves that puffed.
Okay.
And that's why I got it, because I did love that book so much. But there's always things that we can use to connect with the book. I have really strong connections with this book. And I think a lot of our children can make the same connection.
The next topic we'd like to share with you is just a simple math game called Which One Doesn't Belong? And we sometimes use this game to prompt prior knowledge, to refine vocabulary, and even to distinguish attributes of a series.
So we're going to start this game with some numbers. So we have 4 numbers, 7, 9, 16, and 25.
Right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to point something out about each of these numbers that distinguishes it from all the others. So if you want to start?
Sure. So the number 7 in this group is the only number that is prime.
Okay. So I'm going to look at 9. 9 is a little tricky here, but 9 is actually the only number that if I add up their digits, doesn't add up to 7. So 7 is 7, 1 and 6 make 7, and 2 plus 5 equals 7.
Awesome. Another example here is the 16. 16 is the only even number in this group.
That's right. And 25, well, we've said a few things about 25, but 25 is the only number that we can make if we add up our other two numbers that are both squares. 9's a square, 16 is a square, and if we add up our other two squares, 25 is the result.
Great. We have another example in the back here using shapes.
Okay, so shapes. So we have 4 shapes here. So I'll start. So with the rectangle is the only one of these 4 that isn't congruent. It's got 2 longer sides and 2 shorter sides.
Okay, I'll use the square over here. The square looks like the only shape here that is actually shaded.
Okay, and then we have a rhombus. The rhombus here is the only shape that is sitting on a vertex. It's not sitting on a base.
And finally, the pentagon is the only shape here with more than 4 sides.
Oh, good job.
There we go.
All right, so for each of these shapes or numbers or whatever it is in our series, we're able to pull out something that distinguishes it from all the others. And this is actually something you could do with lots of different things. You could probably get 4 family members and find one thing that distinguishes them from all the other people in the family. Or maybe you could do this with 4 books.
Sure.
Or 4 plants.
Yes.
There's always things that we can find that distinguish something from something else. And it's a great way to keep our kids thinking and noticing and keeping all of their skills going while they're not in school. All right. Well, one of the things that is so important to us here at the Department of Ed is math. And we have a campaign called Math for Life. And Math for Life is just this belief, right? That we're always going to do math.
Right.
We do math as long as we live. And so we actually even have a pledge that is for Math for Life. And we wanted to share that with you.
Okay,
Wanna
awesome.
start?
So I'll start. I pledge to approach math with an open mind.
I will celebrate my mistakes as opportunities to grow.
And I will be confident and work hard to understand math and won't give up.
Our Math for Life pledge actually applies to so many things in our lives, but it's something that we want for our students. We want them not to give up. We want them to be confident. And by practicing math and using math while they're at home, it's a great way to work to make sure that happens.
Absolutely. Thank you for spending some time here with us as we shared resources and ideas to support students in middle and high schools.
Thanks, Ms. Close and Mr. Lambert. All right, well, that wraps up everything for us here today on Education Station. We want to thank everyone who submitted their awesome lessons, and we want to thank you for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Education Station.